How many times did you check your phone today before even brushing your teeth? 3 times? 5? Maybe 10? And that strange sensation that comes right after, as if something were missing, as if you were late for something important that you can't even define, this restlessness isn't your imagination. It's the first symptom of a psychological epidemic that's already happening right under our noses, and by 2026 will become impossible to ignore. While we debate artificial intelligence and climate change, a silent crisis is devouring our most fundamental capacity, the ability to simply be present in our own lives. You probably know this person. They work beside you, maybe live in the same house as you, or maybe it's you yourself. During the day, they function perfectly. They answer emails, attend meetings, smile in social media photos. But inside, there's constant agitation, background noise that never stops. It's as if there were a television on 24 hours a day in their mind, flipping channels between anxiety about the future and regrets about the past, never managing to tune into the present moment. This person is living what we might call the first phase of the great psychological fragmentation of our era. We are witnessing something unprecedented in human history. For the first time, an entire civilization is systematically losing contact with its own inner experience. For millennia, human beings developed different forms of consciousness and self-knowledge. The ancient Greeks had the concept of gnothi seoton, know thyself, carved in the temple of Apollo at Delphi. Eastern traditions created sophisticated systems of meditation and introspection. Even tribal societies possessed rites of passage and contemplative practices that connected the individual with their inner mental landscape. But in just 2 decades, we've managed to create an environment that makes this internal connection not just difficult, but almost impossible for most people. What changed wasn't just the amount of information we process daily, but the very temporal structure of how we experience reality. Our ancestors lived in natural cycles, sunrise and sunset, the seasons, biological rhythms that governed both work and rest. There was time for contemplation because there were natural intervals in human experience. Moments of silence were a normal part of life, not something that needed to be scheduled between commitments. Today, we've inadvertently created an environment of perpetual stimulation, where every second of possible mental quietude is immediately filled with notifications, updates, or the compulsion to seek the next stimulus. The real tragedy isn't in the fact that we are more digitally connected. The tragedy lies in how this external hyperconnectivity has created a profound disconnection from our own mental processes. We've lost the ability to observe our thoughts and emotions without completely identifying with them. It's as if we were actors who forgot they were playing a role and started believing they were actually the characters they portray. We can no longer distinguish between the observer and the observed within our own minds. This confusion between being and thinking is creating a particular form of psychological suffering that previous generations simply didn't know. It's not depression in the classical sense, nor anxiety as traditionally understood by psychology. It's something more subtle and at the same time more pervasive. A persistent sensation of existential displacement, as if we were watching our own life happen through a screen always slightly out of focus, always slightly out of sync. The algorithms that govern our digital experiences weren't designed with our mental health in mind. They were optimized to capture and maintain attention. And they discovered that the most effective emotional states for this purpose are precisely those that keep us psychologically dysregulated. Urgency, indignation, desire, social comparison, fear of missing something important. Every scroll, every notification, every update was calibrated to activate our stress response systems in small but constant doses, creating a chronic state of alert that our organisms weren't designed to sustain. The result is an entire generation living in a state of permanent sympathetic activation of the nervous system. Our bodies are constantly prepared to flee or fight threats that never materialize physically, but which our mind interprets as real because they reach us through the same sensory channels that process information about the real world. An email notification awakens the same neurological response that our ancestors felt when hearing a predator's roar in the forest, but without the possibility of resolution through physical action. Artificial intelligence is exponentially accelerating this process of psychological fragmentation, not because machines are becoming conscious, but because they're becoming increasingly efficient at mapping and manipulating the unconscious patterns of our mental behavior. Every interaction we have with digital systems feeds algorithms that create increasingly precise models of how our attention works, what our emotional weak points are, and how to keep us engaged longer. We're inadvertently training artificial intelligences to hack our own consciousness with a precision that we ourselves don't possess about our mental processes. In 2026, this dynamic will reach a critical inflection point. The first generations that grew up completely immersed in this digital environment will be entering full adulthood, assuming positions of responsibility in society, forming families, making important political and economic decisions. But many of these people never developed the basic psychological skills necessary to navigate the emotional complexity of human life without constant mediation of external stimuli. They know how to function within the digital system, but they don't know how to function within their own minds. Simultaneously, artificial intelligence systems will be reaching levels of sophistication where they can simulate human interactions in ways practically indistinguishable from real communication. This will create a new category of relationships where people develop genuine emotional bonds with entities that don't possess subjective experience. There will be nothing inherently wrong with these connections, but they will introduce an additional layer of complexity to the already fragile human capacity to distinguish between authentic experience and simulated experience. The psychological crisis of 2026 won't be a single event, but the moment when these different factors converge in a way that makes visible what's already happening underground, it will be like when you finally realize you're sick, not because the illness started at that moment, but because the symptoms that had been gradually accumulating finally became impossible to ignore. Millions of people will simultaneously reach a point where they can no longer sustain the illusion that they're functioning psychologically well just because they can maintain their external responsibilities. The signs are already all around us. The exponential increase in anxiety and depression diagnoses among young adults, the epidemic of loneliness affecting people who technically have never been more socially connected, the growing inability to sustain attention on activities that don't provide immediate rewards, the proliferation of compulsive behaviors related to digital consumption, the increase in psychiatric medication use as a way of dealing with what are essentially attentional dysregulation problems. All of these are symptoms of a broader phenomenon, the gradual erosion of our capacity for psychological self-regulation. But here's something crucial that most analyses of this topic leave out. We're not just dealing with a technological problem that can be solved through better interface design or digital regulation policies. We're dealing with a fundamental question about the nature of human consciousness and how it adapts to environments radically different from those in which it evolved. Technology is the catalyst, but the underlying problem is much deeper. Our species never developed the conceptual tools necessary to consciously navigate civilizational transformations of this magnitude and speed. For most of human history, social and technological changes happened over generations. There was time for cultures to develop practical wisdom about how to deal with new challenges. Traditions could be transmitted and gradually refined. Today, the speed of transformation is such that the life experiences of one generation are almost irrelevant to the challenges the next generation will face. We are constantly navigating completely new territory without map, compass, or experienced guides. And it's precisely here that we find both the danger and the extraordinary opportunity of our historical moment. The approaching psychological crisis isn't inevitable for everyone. There's a fundamental difference between those who are being passively shaped by these forces and those who are consciously developing the capacity to observe and choose their own responses to them. The difference isn't in intelligence, education, or material resources. It lies in the presence or absence of what we might call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own mental processes in real time. I want to pause for a moment to ask you directly, can you distinguish between having an anxious thought and being an anxious person? Between feeling anger and being defined by that anger? Between experiencing boredom and believing your life is boring? It might seem like a subtle distinction, but it's exactly this capacity for observation that will determine who navigates through the psychological turbulences of the coming years with wisdom and who is simply swept away by them. If these questions awaken something in you, if you recognize that you often confuse yourself with your temporary mental states, share in the comments, I confuse my thoughts with my identity when. Your honesty can help other people recognize they're not alone in this fundamental confusion that affects almost all of us. Metacognitive awareness might sound like an abstract concept, but it's actually a very practical skill that can be developed through specific training. It's the difference between being the main character in a movie and being simultaneously the character, the director, and the spectator observing the story unfold. When you develop this dual perspective, events in your mental experience maintain their natural emotional impact, but lose the capacity to completely define who you are or how you should respond to the world. This ability isn't new. It has been cultivated in different forms throughout human history, through contemplative practices, life philosophies, spiritual traditions, and even certain forms of psychotherapy. What is new is the urgency with which these skills have become necessary for basic psychological functioning in modern life. What was once considered an optional refinement of human experience has now become a fundamental necessity for maintaining mental sanity in an environment of unprecedented stimulation and complexity. People who develop this capacity for conscious observation don't become immune to the psychological challenges of our era, but they develop a different type of relationship with them. When they experience anxiety, for example, they can observe, anxiety is present now. Interesting. What is it trying to communicate to me? How can I respond to this information wisely instead of just reacting automatically? This shift in perspective transforms anxiety from a state that you are into information that you receive. The same principle applies to all other forms of mental turbulence that will become increasingly common as we navigate through accelerated social and technological changes. Anger, sadness, confusion, overwhelm, loneliness, all these emotional states carry valuable information about our situation and needs, but we can only access this information when we're not completely identified with them, when we can observe our internal states with curiosity instead of resistance or total identification. They become allies in navigating complexity instead of forces that dominate us. This capacity for conscious observation also fundamentally modifies our relationship with technology. Instead of being passively influenced by algorithms competing for our attention, we can begin to notice in real time how different types of digital stimuli affect our mental states. We can observe when an app is making us more agitated, when a platform is amplifying our tendency to judge, when a particular form of content is disconnecting us from our sense of presence. With this information, we can make conscious choices about how, when, and why we engage with different technologies. But perhaps even more importantly, metacognitive awareness allows us to recognize that our experience of reality is much more malleable than we normally assume. Most of our psychological suffering doesn't come directly from external events in our lives, but from our habitual interpretations and reactions to those events. When we realize we have some choice over how we interpret and respond to circumstances, we discover that we possess much more power over our internal experience than we ever imagined. This doesn't mean we can simply think positive and make all problems disappear. It means we can develop wisdom about which aspects of our experience are worth fighting to change and which aspects it's wiser to learn to accept and work with. It means we can distinguish between genuine pain that signals something important and unnecessary suffering we create through resistance to reality. It means we can learn to respond to life's difficulties with creativity and flexibility instead of just reacting with automatic patterns that often amplify problems. This distinction between conscious response and automatic reaction will be absolutely crucial as we navigate the growing complexities of the next decade. People who develop the capacity to pause between stimulus and response, to observe their initial reactions before acting on them, to consciously choose how to interpret ambiguous events, these people will have an enormous psychological advantage over those who remain completely identified with their automatic mental and emotional patterns. And here we arrive at a fascinating irony. In an era where machines are becoming more intelligent, the distinctly human ability that becomes most valuable isn't our capacity to process information faster or solve more complex problems. It's our capacity to simply be present with our own experience without being completely defined by it. It's the capacity to observe our own mental processes with curiosity, compassion, and wisdom. It's the ability to consciously choose our responses instead of just reacting automatically. The implications of this shift extend far beyond individual mental health. When people develop greater self-awareness, they naturally become less susceptible to psychological manipulation in all its forms. They can detect when their emotions are being deliberately activated for commercial or political purposes. They can recognize the difference between information that genuinely serves their interests and information designed to capture their attention through activation of their fears and desires. They can participate in public discourse more constructively because they're not constantly reacting from their own unexamined emotional triggers. A society composed of individuals with greater self-awareness would naturally be more resilient to many of the destructive forces that currently polarize and fragment our communities. When you're not completely identified with your own opinions and positions, you can engage in genuine dialogue with people who think differently without feeling that your identity is being attacked. When you can observe your own biases and blind spots, you can update your beliefs based on new information without experiencing this as a fundamental threat to your sense of self. But perhaps the most profound impact of this transformation in consciousness would be our collective capacity to make wise decisions about how we want our civilization to develop. Many of the most important choices we face as a species about technology, governance, economics, and environment require our capacity to consider long-term consequences instead of just reacting to short-term pressures and impulses. They require our capacity to act based on wisdom instead of just fear or greed. They require our capacity to cooperate effectively, even when we have significant differences in perspective. All of these capacities emerge naturally when individuals develop greater self-awareness and less identification with their automatic mental and emotional patterns, not because they become less human or less emotional, but because they develop a type of emotional intelligence that allows them to use their emotions as valuable information instead of being dominated by them. The psychological crisis of 2026 is therefore also an extraordinary opportunity. It's a moment when many people will simultaneously reach a point where they can no longer ignore the need to develop a more conscious relationship with their own mental processes. It's a moment when the limitations of living on psychological autopilot will become so evident that millions of people will feel a genuine urgency to learn self-knowledge, skills that our mainstream culture never considered. Priorities. This crisis will force our society to recognize that basic psychological education about how our mind works, how to observe our own mental processes, how to distinguish between experience and interpretation, how to develop emotional balance amid chaos, all these skills are as fundamental to basic human functioning as literacy or basic mathematics. Perhaps more fundamental, because without them, even very intelligent and educated people remain vulnerable to manipulation and make important decisions based on unexamined emotional patterns. So while the title of this video may sound apocalyptic, the reality is much more hopeful. Yes, we're entering a period of unprecedented psychological turbulence. Yes, many people will face significant mental health challenges as the pressures of our technological environment intensify. But we're also on the threshold of a possible revolution in human consciousness, where skills that were preserved mainly in specialized contemplative traditions become widely available and culturally valued. The tools to navigate through this transition already exist. They have been developed and refined over thousands of years by people who faced their own unique challenges in understanding the nature of the human mind. Mindfulness, meditation, philosophical inquiry, consciousness-based therapies, all these approaches offer practical methods for developing the capacity to observe your own mental processes without being completely dominated by them. What's new is that these skills are no longer optional for those interested in spiritual growth or personal development. They're becoming basic necessities for anyone who wants to maintain their sanity and autonomy in a world of growing stimulation and complexity. The difference between those who develop these capacities and those who don't will be the difference between surfing the waves of change with skill and grace versus being constantly knocked down and dragged by them. If these reflections have touched something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't found words to express, know that you're not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you'll connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the psychological challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not just understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we're witnessing. This isn't just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth, where we can develop together the skills we'll need to thrive in the extraordinary times ahead. Join us in this journey of discovery and conscious transformation. The question that remains is simple. Will you choose to consciously develop the skills necessary to navigate through this transformation? Or will you allow external forces to shape your psychological experience without your conscious participation? The choice is yours, and the moment to make this choice is now, before the crisis of 2026 makes this decision much more difficult and urgent than it needs to be.
I would assume that us having more information and more access to information would lead to more truth, less conspiracy, more agreement, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
No, not at all. Most information in the world is junk. It's like with food.
There was a time, like a century ago in many countries, where food was scarce. So people ate whatever they could get, especially it was full of fat and sugar. And they thought that more food is always good. Like if you ask your great-grandmother, she would tell, yes, more food is always good. And then we reach a time of abundance. And we have all this industrialized processed food, which is artificially full of fat and sugar and salt and whatever. And it's obviously bad for us. The idea that more food is always good, no. And definitely not all this junk food. And the same thing has happened with information.
The book is about the history of information. Nexus means connection, and information is connection. People often think about information as something related to truth, but most of the information in the world is not an attempt to tell the truth. It's not necessarily lies. If you think, for instance, about music, music is information, but music never tells the truth and never lies. There is a lot of bad music that people created over the years, but there is no fake music. It's just impossible to create fake music. What does music do? It connects people. It doesn't tell us the truth about something. It can make a lot of people in a club sway together to the sound of the same song. It can make a lot of soldiers march together in lockstep. It can make churchgoers to chant and to swing together. So this is what information does. It connects, and this is why the book is called Nexus, Connection.
One of the key problems I see today in the world is that you have an extremely cynical view of humans and of human societies spreading both on the right but also on the left. They say that the only reality is power, that all social interactions, all human interactions are actually power struggles, that all human institutions are just conspiracies to gain power, that journalists, scientists, historians, judges, politicians, these are just conspiracies to gain power. Whenever somebody tells you something, you shouldn't ask, is it true? Because nobody cares about the truth. This is naive. They would tell you, no, this is a power play.
Who benefits?
Who benefits?
Yeah.
Whose privileges are being served? Whose interests are being served? This is something that Donald Trump agreed with Karl Marx, at least on that everything is just a power struggle. And if you think like that, all trust collapses, and the only thing that is left standing, that can remain standing, is a dictatorship. This is not just extremely cynical, this is just wrong. People are not these power-crazy demons